Hello, Startup Boston Week. It's me again. If you've watched literally any of the People Ops Track events, you know my name's Allison and I'm your host today. And I am one of the organizers for this great week. Now on my screen that I always forget to share, let's see if I can finagle this. There we go. Right now, we are playing Virtual Possibilities, how to create remarkable hiring and onboarding experiences for remote candidates. If you meant to go to the DIY or don't do it yourself panel, you are unfortunately in the wrong spot and can click agenda to toggle over to your desired panel. But like this one's going to be fantastic. So you probably just shouldn't leave us anyways. Now, while folks are navigating there, I do also just want to highlight that we absolutely heart eyes emoji love questions. So please use that Q&A tab on the far right of your screen to submit any questions you may have during today's session. That's why we created this conference. It's for your learning. So please ask whatever questions are on your mind. We only have this fabulous panel here for 1 hour only today, but maybe you can connect with them on LinkedIn after. And also another fun announcement is that we actually have a super awesome social media competition happening right now. In short, you'll want to pay attention to what our speakers are saying. And if you post an awesome quote on social media using the hashtag SBW2021, you will then be entered to win one of 5 $100 gift cards to a Black-owned Boston business. Yes, love to see it. So again, that is hashtag SBW2021. And before I turn the reins over to our amazing moderator, Lexi, I see we've got a good group watching. Where are y'all dialing in from? I'm over here in Cambridge, Mass. Nina, where are you dialing in from today?
Currently in New Jersey.
Amazing. We got Jersey. Audience, let's drop it into the session chat. Where are you? Taylor, where are you today?
I'm dialing in from New York.
Amazing. Ooh, we got Boston. We got New Hampshire. Anik, where are you?
I am just in plain old Boston right now.
Hey, it's not plain and it's not old. Well, yes, it is old. I take that back. Comment withdrawn. And Lexi, where are you today?
Presently, I'm in Colorado.
Very cool. Amazing. We got Quincy representing. We got Nigeria. Dope. That's awesome. North Carolina. We got California. We got Ohio. Amazing. Well, thank you so much for sharing that and tuning in, y'all. I am going to toss it over to Lexi.
Hi, everyone. Well, my name is Lexi, and I use she, hers pronouns. I'm really thrilled to be here at Startup Boston and to chat with all of our wonderful speakers about creating a remote hiring and onboarding experience that is remarkable and wonderful for all candidates. Please join me in welcoming Anik, our VP of People and Culture at Super Pedestrian, Taylor, Director of Talent Acquisition at Wistia, and Nina, People Operations Manager at Vibi. Our discussion today will focus on current trends in remote hiring and onboarding and creating a high-quality candidate experience virtually and creating consistency and excellency between the recruitment process and onboarding experience. So Anik, take it away. What are some current trends in remote hiring and onboarding?
Yeah, it's a very loaded question here, Lexi. So I'll start off with sort of the basics, and I'll share that there's currently this idea that you can hire anywhere and everywhere just because it's available, right? We have moved away from this idea of everybody has to be in the same office, everybody has to be co-located. Culture only means that you're physically in an office space sharing something with a team. I think hiring and sort of perpetuating culture in that way has moved far beyond that, with sort of the virtual possibilities, as the panel is called, on the horizon for us now. And we've diversified in terms of who we're able to hire, what time zone they are in, honestly, where they are on the globe for that matter. And I think that in itself is sort of the trend that I want to highlight of diversification across the board is really has opened up a lot of possibilities for both companies and, generally speaking, people looking for jobs.
Absolutely. Taylor, tell me more.
Yeah, +1 to Anik. And one of my favorite trends actually is kind of plural. It's really that all the new possibilities that we have in terms of how we hire. And just one example there's a new tool that we use that has been incredibly influential to how we hire that wouldn't even have been possible before the pandemic. But it's called Luma Teams. And similar to how sales teams will record sales calls for training purposes and for quality assurance and things like that, Luma helps us record interviews, which might sound a little creepy, but it's actually not. People are actually surprisingly comfortable with it. And it's been incredibly helpful for us to check our biases as a team and also rely on more than just memory when filling out scorecards and assessing candidates in a debrief and things like that. It's not something we could have done with in-person interviewing. So I love all these new ways to hire that weren't even possible before. I definitely think they'll stick around and we'll keep building off of this. Yeah.
That's excellent. The interview process has changed so drastically. And Nina, I would love to hear your thoughts on integrating new employees after onboarding. What does that look like?
Yeah, for sure. And just before I answer this question, I want to welcome everybody to the panel. I'm super excited to be here. And as far as integrating employees into the onboarding process after recruiting, I think there are like 2 to 3 steps you really have to consider. One is even if before you begin recruiting and hiring, meeting with your managers and ensuring that the candidate profile that they're recruiting for is up to date, and knowing what type of personalities or what type of talent you want to recruit into your team is really, really important, because really at the first touch base of it all is when you start to interact with those employees that do either apply for your jobs or if you do reach out to them. So having a great candidate and solid experience, I think, is the first way. And then secondly, just with delegations of tasks, I think it's super important for your managers to know like who owns what and what responsibilities, and when do these onboarding tasks and trainings have to be done in more so of an according manner. And one of the ways that we've been doing it at Vivi here particularly is when we do the onboarding handoff to our HQ teams, or really to our school teams, it's to full understanding that this is your onboarding schedule that you're going to follow. This is the training and paperwork that you're going to have to get in an accordingly manner. And this is sort of where your first day and first week looks like. So that way you can definitely set up your new employees for success, because at the end of the day, it's really not all about like the paperwork and admin side of it. It's more about bringing your new talent into a new environment and welcoming them just into your family. So I think getting the logistical pieces of it is important, while also thinking about, you know, how do you contribute this talent and how do you have them add value inside your company there.
Absolutely. I was reading yesterday about culture add as opposed to culture fit. I think that can be such a wonderful way to look at onboarding. And Anik, tell me what it looks like at Super Pedestrian.
Yeah, it's not just a Super Pedestrian trend that I'd actually like to sort of focus on here. It's this sort of theme of, I would say, empowerment to managers, right? It's actually a really important point of the managers are, you know, essentially going to be in charge of those employees and have spent a bunch of time on the hiring process to get them excited and sort of, you know, evaluate their fit onto the team. So I think part of the practice that we've really taken on here is putting a lot of the emphasis on the hiring manager ultimately being ready to welcome the employee on board. So we equip the manager with a lot of the sort of tactical day-to-day components of what it would look like to have that employee join, whether it's, you know, hey, information about here's what they could look at on day 1, here's what they could look at as far as day 10. And we actually encourage the manager to do periodic check-ins. Alongside that, we try to make sort of a cohesive experience for cohorts of new hires that are joining. And we, you know, at Super Pedestrian, we've been very fortunate where we've been going through hypergrowth. So we've been welcoming a lot of people over the course of the past 6 months. And it's exciting. At the same time, it can get really complicated really fast. So sort of decluttering that, we've tried to build sort of an idealized version of, hey, here's who else is joining with you today, if at all possible. It gives you a sense of cohesiveness, a sense of belonging, and it certainly creates a little bit of affinity with the folks that are joining with you at the same time. It doesn't make you feel alone is kind of the point. So that's part of how I think we've addressed part of the onboarding experience, especially as we continue to grow in a distributed fashion, right? It's now more distant than ever, and now having sort of the ability to say, oh, I joined with X other person, or, you know, Taylor and I joined on the same day at Super Pedestrian. It's sort of a cool, quick thing that you can refer to as part of your onboarding experience. So yeah, I hope that added some value to somebody out there.
Absolutely. And on that same vein of adding in the small moments that make things all the more exciting, Taylor, tell me about those moments of delight for new onboards, what that looks like remote and in person and in a hybrid space.
Yeah, so I'll answer this question more from a hiring point of view rather than onboarding, but still could apply it certainly. This is Startup Week, Boston, so I'm sure there's a lot of startup folks in the audience. But one of the key advantages that startups and small teams in general have when hiring is culture, right? I know that at Wistia before the pandemic, we had such an advantage for candidates that would come from an interview at Wayfair or say like Rapid7 or HubSpot. And it was really just that feeling you get when you walk into a Wistia office. It's that small team environment, it's creative, it's friendly. And when the pandemic hit, suddenly candidates were experiencing our team through the same Zoom screen they were experiencing the Wayfair team or the HubSpot team. And that advantage was like almost totally gone. So for us, it's video. And luckily, Wistia is a video tech company. We have an incredibly talented video team. But we really sat down and looked at how we can insert video into almost every step of the interview process, from our TA coordinator, including a small video intro in her email outreach, introducing herself with a smile, to even creating a Wistia channel with a lot of internal culture content that's not even accessible publicly, as a cool way to invite folks into our culture before they are able to really experience it. So that's how we've looked at it. We definitely also leverage this in onboarding as well. We have like a huge amount of video that we share with folks when they're getting started. But that's been, I think, the best way to keep hiring human in this remote world and to help people see our culture firsthand.
I love that. Must be such a good insight for all your new hires. And I'm curious to know as well, how are you showing your culture in your recruitment and hiring processes? Tell me a little bit more about what that looks like.
Yeah, this is a great question, because I think a lot of companies actually don't get the full value out of their talent teams that they could. And for me, it really starts with the culture on my team. I get so much joy out of building teams and what I do. It's incredibly important for me that my recruiters also are getting joy out of what they do. Because when we hire recruiters, we're not hiring actors, right? We're hiring people to look for talent. And candidates can tell if you are loading your recruiters up with 20 to 40 recs, expecting them to do a good job, that's not going to be an enjoyable experience, and they're not going to be able to do quality work, right? And again, we're not hiring actors, so candidates can sense that and feel that. So for me, I put a ton of focus on the culture of my team, as we're really the first experience anyone has with our culture in our company. And if my team's not having fun, then that is bad, for the business, and it makes for a crappy experience all around. So, I think we do have a lot of fun doing what we do. So,
That's excellent. Nina, tell me, what's your take?
Yeah, for sure. I think when you are hiring, it does have to be when you do have to understand like where a person is coming from with respect to, if they do meet the core competencies, or, if they are culture fit and personality add to your company, all of that is important. But how I like to spice up my recruiting process, which me primarily I oversee our campus recruitment. So speak of a lot of early childhood educators who often spend a lot of time in schools and are on their feet working 8 hours a day. So entirely it is exhausting work. So you have to figure out how to really sell it and pitch it to them in order for them to want to come to your school in like a super competitive field, just really across New York and generally. So here at Vivi, what we do is, again, we do meet with the managers just to get a good understanding of staffing models and placements in respective classrooms, just because you want a group of teachers to work seamlessly and mesh well together. But at the end of the day, it's really thinking about more so like, what does Vivi instill into your life? Like, what is our value add to your life versus like what you can really do for us as well. So one of the things we really focus on sort of in like the recruiting process is really understanding like where an educator is currently at in their life position with respect to your career. So what kind of professional development opportunities can we give you? How can we help you grow as an educator in the classroom? And so those are all the questions that I like to ask. And we see all of our teachers as owners versus, just simply being a teacher and employee. So really instilling our core values into the interview process is also super, super important, just because everybody is a part of the company. And one of the things that we actually do as part of our compensation package is really to give everybody stock options as well. So that way they have some kind of financial incentive to really come into our company and help us build from the ground up. So that's where we're currently at right now. And because we're a small startup, we're just really only getting started. So there's still a lot to do really on both the front end and as well as the back end there.
I'm sure, but I love that you think about each of your new folks from the perspective of their own life and what they have to add. I think that makes for such a valuable experience for them and for you. And this is something that I want to hear from all of you on. I'm curious about creating a really smooth transition and maintaining that level of excellence between recruitment and onboarding. Tell me what that looks like for each of you.
Yeah, I'm happy to go first and jump in simply because I do own both parts of the function. So me being the main recruiter on the campus front and then transitioning them into onboarding. So of course, it has to be a seamless process where it's mostly built in on the back end first. And we've tested this out a couple of times with new groups of teachers we brought on board and have asked them for feedback as to improve our process every single time. So usually how we keep ourselves organized with just respect to, being on campus and teachers having to submit a whole lot of paperwork even before they start is we create an onboarding checklist and send sort of informational material to them saying, okay, your trainings and paperwork have to be in by this day. And then there are certain touch points that we do in between just to check in on them, see if they have any questions. And really being in constant communication is the way to go, just because you simply don't want your employees to feel as though they're being ghosted or just drop off once they accept the offer and are on board. So we use an onboarding checklist that whenever a teacher first arrives on campus, like during the first 3 days, these are the X, Y, and Z things you have to do. I also do like check-ins, so 2-week, 30, 60, 90-day check-ins with all of our teachers just to understand fully how their experience is going on campus and really communicate any feedback or suggestions that they have back to the school team. So over time, if there are small things that we do have to tweak as part of our onboarding process, or if there are things on campus that are not being done correctly, like we can make those process improvements more so on the back end so that the next group of teachers and next round of individuals we bring on board won't experience those same growing pains.
Iterate, right?
Yep, times 3.
Yeah, I think it also really starts with how you operate as a people team. I think there's a lot, especially in larger companies, there's a lot of people teams that for some reason separate recruiting from HR business partners and learning and development. And I never really understood that because I think really the experience is all one. And if you separate your teams that way, then you tend to get a pretty fragmented experience. So the caveat would be that it's easier to work as one team when you're a smaller team. And that can be hard to scale. I understand that. But for us, we work very closely from start to finish. We do weekly hiring touch points. So our HR side is completely aware of everything coming through the pipeline, likely hires. When we have rejected offers, we'll even talk about the details of why that might have been. So it starts with us, like everyone's in the loop and we're all kind of on the same page there. The smaller detail would be, in an ideal state on our team, our talent coordinator is also helping coordinate onboarding. And so there's a familiar face from going from external candidate to internal employee. You already have that relationship there with that person that's helping you through that. But again, with varying workloads, it's not always easy to maintain that single point of contact. So.
Yeah, just to add to both Nina and Taylor's points, just to kind of tell the story of Super Pedestrian and the growth that we've experienced, and to Taylor's point, it can be a lot simpler, working as a cohesive team, especially when you're sort of a little bit smaller. But the trajectory of Super Pedestrian has taken us essentially by the end of 2020 at about 80 people in terms of headcount to now we're actually bursting at the seams at over 500. So we've, essentially 5x and 5 or almost 6x in growth over the past year, which has been insane. Now, that being said, something that we've had to deal with on essentially this coordination point between talent acquisition and sort of people has been the systems and the technology that we use, right? In certain cases, a good HRIS, as an example, can handle all of the information inflow of here's the start date, here's who it is, here's what department, here's the location. I think that is a great tool to sort of have in your back pocket. For my own experience and sort of my team's experience, unfortunately, we've had to operate off of fragmented systems. We have an ATS, we have two iterations of HRISs, because we've had to implement sort of a solution to help us go global very suddenly without sort of having the ability to truly suss out all of those details. Now we're working through it by actually introducing another system, which is sort of a Band-Aid system, but we're using something called Monday.com. It's sort of a project management kind of workflow board that'll help us sort of distill down all of these elements, right? A new hire checklist, as an example, into each of the new hires that are coming into the system. We're trying to track every single thing in Monday.com once it's out of our ATS. That way we can truly have visibility across our entire team of all the new hires that are starting and sort of seeing where the deficiencies are as well. The good news is, I would say onboarding from a practical and logistical point of view isn't just sort of a people and sort of talent type of task, right? It incorporates the business themselves. It incorporates other support functions such as IT, as an example, who's in charge of procurement of equipment, making sure that the laptop is there for the new hire on day one, and et cetera, et cetera. So having some sort of centralized tool that'll allow you to truly understand and sort of benchmark what the new hires are expecting and going through and arriving, and how to best prepare them, that I think is a recipe for success, especially in growing startups. I know that Startup Week Boston is all about sort of growth and going through expansion. As any company of any size is going through this, having a system that allow you to have central visibility, whether it's like a Jira or a Trello or a Monday.com in our case, something that allows you to sort of have that sort of source of truth about new hires and enforcing that, I think has been super helpful for me, at least.
Absolutely. And there's so many ways to go about it too. You got to kind of find the jeans that fit, right? I'm curious, Anik, if you could talk a little bit about the consistency in onboarding. How are you making sure that all candidates are having the same experience, especially in a 6x growth kind of situation?
To be honest with you, it's been an uphill battle, right? So completely transparently, it wasn't the same on day one that it is at now. So we've made sort of continuous iteration and sort of improvements over time. But one thing that we, I think, immediately addressed was we needed to have more involvement from other team members outside of the people and talent team, outside of the managers. It's setting up infrastructure to allow folks to kind of see, oh, I can connect with XYZ other people. So going back to my earlier point from the beginning, setting up sort of a cohort of new hire starts has been helpful, but additionally kind of addressing the buddy system, if you will, as part of a new hire and onboarding experience, whether it's hybrid or fully remote, has gone, really well on that front. Somebody that they can turn to on a regular basis, no matter what, right? Even if they come into the office, they have a buddy that they can rely on to say, okay, where's the snack room? On the other hand, if they're remote and completely on an island and they don't work anywhere near an office, they have a buddy that they can turn to, whether it's virtually on Slack, or hopefully they can just call up and say, hey, how do I do this thing? I think that in itself, sort of providing a human resource, and I hate to use that term because HR is really not really the modern term these days, but a human kind of interface to allow you to kind of onboard and help yourself has been invaluable. Alongside kind of data, right? Like I think that's something that the people and talent teams that I've worked with have been able to sort of supply a centralized database of learning. In our case, it's a Confluence, right? It's part of the Jira kind of infrastructure, the Atlassian infrastructure that we have in our backbone, but a central repo where you can turn to and say, what is the time off policy? What is the, when do I get paid? All of these very minute details that you might not remember from day one, like just an onboarding meeting, you can turn to and say, oh, this is where I go to. So equipping those folks with people, kind of a face to turn to, the resources to actually get just self-help, as well as, just having, again, that sort of ability to reach out to somebody, I think is super important. So again, hopefully that's helpful.
Absolutely. And I'm also really fascinated by the variety that comes with distributed teams. So I would love to hear your thoughts. Taylor, if you don't mind getting us going. how are you approaching compensation for distributed teams, especially with highly varied costs of living across the globe?
Yeah, that's a great question. Just making sure I'm unmuted. This was a trend that was sort of starting to begin even before the pandemic, right? As more companies were more comfortable with hybrid or remote work, especially for specialized individual contributors, the more we started to feel like we're all competing with Bay Area salaries, right? For us, it's really important that equity is at the center of our compensation conversations. And to be honest with you, adding geographic elements to that can tend to just complicate things unnecessarily. And so we're lucky to operate in the Boston market, which tends to be a pretty expensive place to do business. We're used to hiring people in Boston. And so for us, we've been able to stay mostly competitive just by paying everyone what we pay in the market, in the Boston market. And that's been the best approach for us. I think the bigger challenge we face that came specifically from the pandemic is the surge in demand for certain skill sets and how that really kind of rattled compensation bands across the board. And the reason why that was so challenging is because we all use the same compensation databases, and that is such a lagging indicator, right? And so I think a lot of teams felt like they were running blind in terms of being really surprised by certain candidates' asks and requirements. So we've definitely erred with a side of caution, but we have had to listen to the market in real time more than usual, rather than leaning on our data as a single source of truth. And that's meant that we've had some conversations in real time about bumping existing employees so that we can be more competitive in certain skill sets without disrupting equity on our team. That's not easy to do in every circumstance, but it's definitely what we've been trying to lead with.
That's excellent. And you bring up a really interesting point about using this data, especially for many of the timelines on collecting data like compensation. I'm curious to know how you're using data to adjust your recruiting and onboarding goals, and what metrics are you focusing on? Anyone who wants to jump in?
I'll jump in first. And I actually wanted to echo sort of Taylor's point on the compensation piece. I think depending on the data sets that you're using, it is a lagging indicator of sorts. So it is something I would be careful of, right? If you're using like a giant data set like a Radford, or if you're using a smaller data set like a Paylocity or something like that, it's an interesting one. I would say the data set that has been most valuable for me in terms of keeping pace with, I would say, whether it's competitors or within the industry or within sort of the live updates, if you will, the closest or the least lagging indicator have been sort of surveys that were administered via our venture capital partners, right? So our investors per se. Our investors conduct sort of regular surveys of their portfolio companies. So if you are part of a startup that has some venture capital in it and have investors that fit this bill, I would highly kind of turn that way immediately and recommend go to your investors, say, hey, do you guys do a compensation survey of your portfolio companies? And I would say that data set actually let us in the recent past sort of live in the real time, right? It's real accurate information, it's real time information, and it's not really pulled out of thin air, if you will, right? It doesn't maybe give you the broadest sense of what's going on, but it gives you very pointed, accurate information of what's going on in the market. So that's been super valuable for me in terms of being able to use that, incorporate that into our compensation philosophy. Other, I would say, indicators have been speed, right? It's funny when you talk about recruiting, and happy to turn it over. I want to hear more from Taylor and on this too, but something that I've noticed as part of sort of the growing evolution of the talent side and necessity of candidate experience has been speed. Everything these days about candidate experience has been about how quickly can you get me through this process? How quickly can you answer me? I have other interviews lined up. The demand and sort of the spike in demand of different skill sets has been insane. And having to navigate through that, having to sort of reduce the time to offer for us has been a critical crunch. And the benchmark that I've used for, I would say, the tech roles that we hire for have been centered around, let's say, 20 to 30 day markers. And that in sort of a past life would be unheard of, right? It's, oh, you're not even hitting 30 days. That's great. Well, now it's become the standard to actually go between 20 and 30 days to, interview, to offer. And that's sort of a significant speed up, right? It presents challenges in some ways and presents challenges to scale. We've been lucky that we've been able to meet that, but that's been a significant challenge. And that's the metric that has sort of driven us to say, well, we need to bolster our recruiting capabilities. We need to be able to move faster, and we need to make decisions more decisively, for lack of better words.
Yes. And sorry, Nina, I just have to add on to that because there is a hill that I will die on, and it is being very explicit about the difference between speed to hire and time to fill. And I make very sure that my hiring managers know to expect it's going to take us 8 to 12 weeks to fill your role. But when I talk about having to be able to move faster, I'm talking about exactly what Anik is talking about. Once we find the right candidate, we have to be able to be nimble and move decisively. And part of doing that is ensuring simplicity in your interview plan, et cetera. But the reason why I'm so adamant about 8 to 12 weeks is because if we want to do our due diligence and find the best talent and add meaningful diversity to our team, there is a time element to every search. And if you want to hire somebody in 4 weeks, that means that you're basically just hiring whoever's in front of you today. And so I'm very stubborn about that. And it's worked to our benefit. And I think managing those expectations up front is really important.
I think I will add that I do have different perspectives from both Anik and Taylor just because I am in a different industry. So with education-wise, what we've noticed in New York particularly is that the competition is more fiercer than ever. It's because there are so many daycare centers and schools around with just a lot to offer all of our educators. So you do have to be quick, but there is definitely a huge difference between speed to hire and time to fill. And what we've really done on our end with respect to both, I guess, having to recruit at a high volume versus planning ahead and forecasting ahead. I'll talk about the latter first. So usually we have currently 3 daycare center locations now, and we look at enrollment numbers. So how many students are on our wait list, how many students are looking to enroll in our programs. Is that like more so on a full-time or part-time basis? And depending on that, usually my schools will come to my particular team and be like, okay, this new classroom is going to open up in November, so you should most likely give yourself at least 6 to 7 weeks of hiring these teachers, and we'll take them slowly through the interview process and really vet them to ensure that they're quality candidates and they'll stay on for longer than a year, which is really the benchmark for early childhood education industry these days. And then there's like times where, unfortunately, because we're employment at will, people just quit without giving too much notice, and school teams are out of classroom ratios, and you do have to really put on your recruiter hat and go out and not only get inbound applications but really also source and really do a lot of cold calls and cold messaging. And that really is the fine line between finding somebody who's a quality candidate versus simply just getting a body into the classroom. And I've definitely found it a bit challenging and struggles of both in terms of having to recruit and hire somebody and bring them on board within 2 weeks versus doing a longer process. But it's definitely also helped us and my team really understand what systems do we need to put in place in order to make sure that we have a solid process that we can move forward. What kind of resources do we need? Is it more so if let's bring on another person on our team who is like a dedicated sourcer to really help us manage our data and recruitment as we continue to scale. So I think it's a combination of understanding what your targeted goals are near term, as well as planning ahead for the future with respect to bringing on talent onto your teams.
Absolutely. I think the goal orientation is so important. And I'd be really interested to know, how have your asynchronous communications changed? Taylor, you mentioned earlier that communication really is everything. How have you pivoted both to candidates and internally?
Yeah, I think in some ways it's been challenging and more challenging, and in some ways it's been a little bit easier. I think in a past life, there were a lot of decisions that were made in the kitchen or in passing in the hallway. And so we do have to be much more intentional about, who comes into what meeting and how the meeting is facilitated and how we follow up via Slack and Quip. And I think maybe the default at the start of going fully remote was tool overload. And we had a few too many tools to communicate on. But I think as we kind of settled in and got used to this new way of collaborating digitally, we've been able to sort of simplify and neat down. But on my team, I really emphasize the importance of consistency because people have to know where to look, and nobody's going to remember what you say in a meeting. They're going to remember where they found information and they got help, right? And so if we're not consistent with where they're finding this information, then it's going to be the Wild West. So I do kind of harp on like, everything has to be the same in our shared Google Doc as it is in Greenhouse, right? And it's super important over time. With candidates, not much has changed on our front, actually. You know, we've always talked about the importance of talking to candidates like they are already on the team and not kind of changing our tone and our language externally. But we're still talking on the phone, over Zoom, and via text with candidates. So I'd say that's been pretty similar.
Excellent. And Nina, do you want to jump in, especially as in a fierce hiring market?
Yeah, for sure. I think I second Taylor's statement as to like making sure that, you know, your data as well as the messaging that gets across to candidates is consistent, and with respect again to our company knowing like exactly what the teacher candidates is looking for is super important as well, just because we're in a very weird operating mode where we do have teachers on schedules, but we do want them to be flexible as well, just because day-to-day can look very unpredictable in a particular classroom wise. So, you know, asking for that from candidates is always a tough sell, simply because you want them to be consistent, but then not really again. So, you know, how do you shape and frame it more so in a way where they're in person, but then again, you know, there are days where they're not on campus as well. I will also say that with respect to our HQ team, where we have a very lean structure right now, it's only 12 people on the team, and there are 3 employees that are remote and really went through the entire remote hiring process. We have never even met them in person yet. So it's going to be super exciting for us to have like an office gathering next Tuesday, but making sure that their candidate experience was the same as those that were brought on board, but, you know, had those in-person meetings in New York. So whether that's with respect to like, you know, arranging the same round of interviews, getting both of our co-founders on Zoom and meeting them and having like in-depth discussions as to like what their role is about and what they're able to contribute to the team, making sure that, you know, the entire onboarding process is the same as it could be if they were, you know, in person as well, with respect to, you know, getting them set up at home, making sure that their laptop arrives on time, all of the paperwork aspects of things. One of the things my company really likes, I personally really like that my company does that any other company I've been part of in the past hasn't done, is whenever we have a new HQ member join us, we all sit down together, and it's via Zoom now. We do these getting to know you meetings. These are like 45-minute sessions where we have like a list of 8 to 10 questions, and we just run through each and every person shares as to like, well, what is your work style like? What is your personality style like? How do you like to communicate? So it really creates and establishes that strong bond with, you know, all of our remote new employees, even though if we've never met them in person. Yeah, it's just a great way to, you know, just build team culture as part of a very, very small HQ startup team right now.
Wonderful. I think it makes such a difference, and I'm seeing some questions come up in the Q&A. I think this is a really excellent moment to take a step back and think about the onboarding a little further down the line. Tell me a little bit about how 30, 60, 90 days into a new role, you're continuing to work with new folks and how that process has changed.
Is that a question for me or? Okay, yeah, so I can definitely take this one. So normally, you know, 30, 60, 90 days for all of our campus-based teachers, I do these check-ins with them, but usually sort of at like the 60-day mark is where we start to evaluate like sort of where their long-term trajectory lies within us. So usually those are via like email check-ins. Okay, how are you doing? Are you finding, you know, the school environment to be suitable towards, you know, where your goals and aspirations are? And sort of at the 90-day mark, what all of our school teams does is every single head of school meets with the new teacher that's been on board for 90 days. And they go through, you know, really series of, you know, how comfortable do you find yourself in the environment? What are some of your short-term and long-term goals, even though those conversations do start at the 30-day mark, but they're only heightened sort of at the 90-day mark, just because we're a super small team and there's a lot of room for internal mobility as well as professional development growth along the way. And so we really want sort of as our retention method and teachers to stay with us for the long term and really grow into more so of, lead teacher role. And then if they don't want to be in the classroom anymore, then in the future, as we're continuing to open up centers all across New York, as well as even across the US, there are roles that are slotted in for them where they can take on more so of like a school admin, role or things like that. And then the school teams and the people team, of course, work very closely together as well to just, report back on the results if there is something that is missing, essentially in part of the onboarding process, or there are things that teachers bring to us with feedback such as, so this is the way that you can continue to improve your culture. We always get lovely feedback from our teachers. They are definitely not shy and are very vocal with their suggestions and feedback as, how we can continue to improve as a company. So that's our model currently right now. I'd love to hear like Taylor and Nick's thoughts on this as well, simply because we're always trying to revamp it just because improvement is good.
I'm happy to speak on a sort of an additional point. I would say there's a few different takes on this as well, right? I think if you're going through hypergrowth, again, I think Super Pedestrian is a good example of hypergrowth where we have grown very, very substantially. I think having the individualized 30, 60, 90-day conversations now take a secondary format is sort of important to recognize. With scale, there come trends, right? With more people and more data to work off of, we've not just relied on sort of the 30, 60, 90-day check-ins, but we've evolved sort of on a periodic, I would say quarterly employee engagement type of survey in addition to the individualized check-ins. I think the individualized check-ins are very powerful, don't get me wrong, but I think we've had to shift our thinking to, well, now that we're this size, there's a broader impact you got to consider. So we've started doing ENPS in addition to, and it's revealed a lot of different interesting trends to us as a result. Having a distributed workforce makes it that much more prevalent for us to actually collect broader sets of data as much as we can. And as anybody else going through hypergrowth, I think it's really important to recognize the need to address sort of different trends and sort of things that come up as you grow through that hypergrowth. Don't get me wrong, again, on this point, it's great to go through hypergrowth and you'll see a lot of improvements within how much you can get done. But I will also say that there's significant growing pains that you'll realize and start to see as a result too. So having an outlet for folks to sort of air that, hey, this is not an individualized issue to me, but rather this is a more institutional issue that I'd like to see sort of whether it's the leadership team address or the company in general sort of address through some program. It's a valuable outlet to open up to folks. So that's sort of I would say my 2 cents on the traditional 30, 60, 90-day check-in. It's take it one step beyond the 30, 60, 90-day and allow folks to kind of chime in on sort of more on a trend basis.
Yeah, we use a tool called 15.5, and this is a tool that facilitates regular feedback back and forth. We also do our periodic performance reviews in this tool, but weekly, every employee sets goals for the next week and reflects on their goals for the past week. And this weekly touch point starts with a how are you feeling 1 through 5. So similar to what Anik's talking about, for us, we get a good temperature check across the org, not just from new hires, but also from everybody. And that's definitely something that we can look at and track, especially when we pop up a new team fairly quickly, how this new team is sort of settling in. And I don't want to contradict myself. I know I was talking about the handoff before and the importance of all these teams working together. But as the talent acquisition person, I typically do not do the 30, 60, 90 check-ins myself. What I do though is, especially for the candidates that my team are bringing in, I always am interested in reaching out as somebody settling in to introduce myself and ask how their experience was. It's a little bit of a random sample, but it's a helpful way for me to kind of keep my ears to the tracks and understand on a qualitative basis how folks are navigating that new experience.
Absolutely. And Nina, I'm gonna direct this one at you. I'm curious to hear your take. How are you managing folks that are both in person and folks that are hybrid? Tell me how you're walking that line to ensure that there's consistency across the board.
Yeah, for sure. I think it's definitely an important factor to take into consideration where we have these campus-based teachers that are in person, and it's the pandemic times as well. So with respect to COVID and safety and health policy, of course, that's our utmost insurance is that we're taking care of our teachers, families, and children at this time. But with respect to our remote workforce, there is not that in-person sort of FaceTime where you're able to see them in the office on a day-to-day basis. So how do you ensure that they're continuing to be looped in and not necessarily miss out on any conversations or any important events that they do need to be a part of? And how we've managed to do that is, I'm sure everybody has used Slack. If you're a tech company, most likely have heard of the communication management platform, but we have two spaces that are dedicated solely, one for teachers, one really for our general teams. We do unfortunately use the Asana as well for project management tools. Not there quite at the point yet where we're using Monday.com, but that definitely helps keep us organized. And for particular HQ teams, we have weekly meetings where Tuesday we go over OKR goals, and every single team reports on what they are working on, priorities for the week, and then Friday are usually our wrap-up meetings where we just share a win from the week, so something that we accomplished over the week, just to celebrate that, and usually like fun weekend plans or something personal that we've accomplished. And overall, I think that has really helped strengthen, again, our HQ team's bond, and just not necessarily separate the professional from personal, just because at the end of the day, we're all humans and work is only a part of our life, even though it is the most, I would say, it takes up the most time of our life. But with respect to that, that's how we felt culture in our HQ team. And then on our campus front team, again, the in-person aspect of it does contribute a lot to the component of it, because you're able to see your co-teachers face to face. You're able to be with the children on a day-to-day basis there.
Wonderful. Anik, take it away.
Yeah, I figured I'd share a little bit about the workforce that I think, Nina, you and I probably have a little bit more in common than folks kind of maybe understand. The workforce at Super Pedestrian is actually a really interesting model. We have in HQ sort of a core staff, if you will, salaried, exempt folks that work in a distributed fashion across the US, globally at this point. But we also have very specific staff that is non-exempt, hourly, if you will, that works in all of our markets. So to boil it down, Super Pedestrian as a company, we're operating a scooter share, right? We build vehicles that then we deploy into the field for sort of sharing, similar to bike share, it's scooter share, and that's kind of our business model. Now, the staff in the field is basically in person all the time, right? They don't have an option to work from home. So we have to actually constantly address this difference between this kind of dual-sided population that we have, the folks that are kind of seeing each other daily in the markets, working hand in hand to actually, work on the scooters, redeploy them, collect them, et cetera, et cetera. And then we have all of these folks that kind of work in a centralized fashion that really don't see each other physically ever. And we have sort of gone fully virtual on that front. So how do we actually deal with that? Well, in recent times, and we've thought about this a little bit more, we've facilitated travel where it makes sense to facilitate travel, to let folks that are never really in markets, to allow them to see the markets. So we've allocated budget to traveling and actually allowing our folks to go see the product that they're working on. Because, what I will say at the end of the day, to connect kind of everybody into the company and truly facilitate onboarding, is if somebody understands how their work on a day-to-day basis contributes to the success of the company, and they really feel it and they really kind of push forward with it, that's when I feel like you've achieved success in onboarding, because they can connect their own work to the mission of the company. So we've taken that to the next level, right? We've facilitated travel. We've implemented this really interesting tool that allows to centralize travel costs and stuff like that, called Trip Actions. If anybody's ever heard of it, Trip Actions, Lola.com, I think they kind of operate off of the same model. And if I were to suggest anything, and if you're wondering, oh, how do I get my remote employees or distributed employees to connect with something that we're actually doing, allow them to travel to see the, whatever product it is that they're working on in action. And if that's physically somewhere, let them go there.
I think that's so beautiful. And ultimately, at the end of the day, that's the connection you want. One of the last questions I wanted to ask of all of you, and feel free to jump in whenever suits you. I'm really curious to hear about when things don't go as well as you want them to. How do you make sure that you continue to fail forward? How do you learn from those mistakes, and where do you make your change first?
Yeah, I can't stress enough the importance of partnership and communication. I find that, when you establish a strong partnership, and you might take risks and bets, but when you communicate the reason why up front, automatically you're in it together, right? And that also kind of helps facilitate the postmortem afterwards. When you're in it together with your stakeholders or even your peers on your team, there's often a shared curiosity into why something went wrong, because we all agreed that this was a good bet to take, right? So that, I think, is really the most important thing. I guess that's been my theme in this panel, is partnership and teamwork, right? But for me, that's great. And of course, always talking about it. On a team where there's a sense of shame or fear of failure, that inhibits your ability to openly talk about these things and learn together to move forward. So be curious and upfront, I guess, but it's hard to do that if you don't have good relationships. It's hard to have that psychological safety.
I can jump in really quickly next. I mean, I think failing is just part of growing, right? I think everybody realizes that. And in startup world, I've had the fortune of, again, being in a number of startups now in my career. And I would say I've failed more often than not, which is kind of a good thing, right? I've learned every time that I have failed. And the reality is, to that exact point, when you fail, I think the advice I can give is fail fast, right? If you're going to try something new, or if you're unsure about trying something, do it, have some conviction behind it, give it your best shot. But if it doesn't go anywhere, I would say fail fast, right? Fail fast and then pivot as quickly as you can away from the sort of failed tactic. And I think if you're able to show that you've learned something from sort of having run an experiment or having failed, it goes so much further. So it's very general, I would say, advice, but that's kind of served me really well over the course of time, And I can put a concrete example to this, right? At Super Pedestrian, as an example, we tried out a number of different tactics. We basically were really stuck on hiring in a very kind of, I would say, virtualized fashion, especially for the roles that are in the field for us. These hourly folks that are on the ground, essentially working on our scooters, right? We thought that we could reach them by just doing virtual, job ads, right? Going to the usual channels of, let's post the job and they'll see it and there'll be a lot of inbound application flow and that'll be the answer. Well, we did that for a period of time and we quickly realized, okay, A, that's not getting us the volume and not getting us the hires that we need. Little did we know at the time, this was back in sort of March timeframe, that we were heading into sort of a labor shortage as well, right? So it was all compounding factors that kind of amounted to, our initial strategy failed because we didn't account for labor shortage. We didn't account for that these folks are really not where they were supposed to be when we thought about the strategy, and we pivoted, right? So the failure point was realizing, okay, this is not where we're going to get candidates from. Instead, we adopted sort of a referral model, and we sort of had a more grassroots approach to it. We equipped our teams on the ground to go refer people. We incentivized the referrals. We then also realized other companies looking for similar types of candidates were doing sign-on bonuses. And then we tried that out for a period of time. It worked in some places, but not others. And again, we pivoted away from it where it didn't make sense. But it's all about sort of keeping track of what you're doing. If you're running an experiment, being able to turn off, any effort that you have if it's not going well, and then reallocating those resources as quickly as possible. So again, I hope that's valuable, but that's been serving me pretty well.
I will add on to both Taylor's and Nick's point, just starting out with Taylor about establishing great relationships and partnerships. And so I think for me particularly, it's, establishing trust and respect between who you're working with is super important, because at times you don't necessarily have to like the person that you're working with. You just have to be able to manage sort of the co-relationships. So ultimately you get to the same targeted goal that both of you are trying to achieve ahead of time. Of course, if you like somebody, that does make the days and work go by easier. And having been at my second startup, I've definitely failed very early on in my career with just making very small mistakes up to like huge mistakes where it could have even, impacted the entire company, and, I could have been laid off as well. But I think it's first accepting that you've made a mistake and having a very honest conversation with parties that have been impacted, or simply just your manager, and explaining why you think you made that mistake and knowing not to do it again and learning from it a second or third time. If you made a mistake, then there's something that's definitely wrong. You really have to go back and figure out why you did it. But recently, we've been hiring on a crazy sprint, and we've had like one or two candidates who have verbally said that they were going to take the position only to really ghost us, and end up rescinding their offers on the back end. And so it's definitely was very hard for our school teams, but we learned from those sort of mistakes and red flags that we should have caught early on in the hiring and recruiting process, and with enough data, just because numbers never really do lie. At the end of the day, we're able to look at those trends and patterns and really get a good understanding of, where are most quality candidates coming from, what job boards, and, how do we pivot our strategies to ensure that even during these tough times that we're not going to make the same particular mistake again and just get to the end goal. So I think at the end of the day, it's, thinking fast on your feet, being a bit more flexible than normal, and really, not being too hard on yourself, because again, we are all humans and we do make mistakes, but it's how we react and learn from them that really matters.
I think Anik gave me a little nugget to walk away with, because I was thinking about what he shared, and really performance metrics can only capture routine behavior, right? And so if we're talking about trying new things and taking risks, I love the idea of tracking your failures and thinking about that in addition to the routine performance metrics. I have some thinking to do about how maybe I implement that.
And then the last thing that I wanted to finish up with today was a question from Jay in the chat. I'm curious to hear, or Jay says, would you each be willing to share something special that your companies are doing in your onboarding? Taylor, take it away.
This is a great question, and I hate to be obvious because, again, Wistia is a video company. But our video content goes so far to welcome people into our culture. Whether it's a fun year wrap up that the team puts together, they'll actually write their own music and produce it, to even just sharing past all company meetings and recent show and tell meetings where folks are sharing what they're working on across the business. It's a great way to catch people up so that when they're participating in their first team meetings, they're not starting from a blank slate. That's something that I like to do, and I actually will share these links myself because I do get to talk to every new employee as they're onboarding to talk about referral bonuses and stuff like that. I'll always insert these links to some of this video content.
I can jump in next really quick. And I don't want to say the things that have already been said, but I think something unique that we've actually started doing, especially this year as we've grown so fast and so rapidly, but also in this kind of complex environment where distributed in the field, seeing each other, not seeing each other, we've implemented this interesting platform called Athena. And it's essentially what I would say a combination of ethics training, but also I would say cultural awareness training that we've sort of pushed out to the population, where, it's talked about, topics such as online etiquette are talked about, things like sexual harassment and anti-sexual harassment training are talked about. It's not necessarily, quote unquote, super unique or super sexy or anything of that nature. But I think some of those elements are sort of lost in the back of your minds when you think about it, right? It's necessary training, but we've tried to put it in such a spin where it sort of supports our culture of, tolerance and inclusion. And more importantly, it's an evolution of where I think we're headed as a sort of a workforce, right? We're going to be operating in this kind of hybrid distributed workforce going forward, right? If nothing else, the pandemic has showed us that this is now possible. And now this is sort of the way forward, potentially, in operating in a nice hybrid model and creating sort of environments and sort of trainings around that as we sort of acclimate our population to sort of completely do that. I think those are kind of unique opportunities. And I'm not saying that Super Pedestrian does it the best way possible. I'm saying that this is sort of something that I would recommend everybody, each of us, looks at from an opportunity perspective.
Great. I guess I'll jump in very quickly just because I know we're almost out of time, but just for the feel good moments versus thinking about onboarding more so of a structured process is what I've shared a lot about, but usually with our distributive workforce as well as our campus-based teachers, we have asked their co-teachers or as their respective employees just to give them shout outs. And usually we do weekly newsletters with our distributed workforce where, if a new employee comes on board, we usually introduce and welcome them. And, they do communicate with each other via Slack and do give shout outs. And for our campus-based teachers, we recognize that it's their first days and we usually highlight them by, sharing out their information and doing more so of having them do create brief profiles that share fun facts about themselves as whereas they're coming, and that's just a really nice way to bridge sort of the gap between our in-person based workforce as well as our distributed workforce, so that everybody knows each other to a certain extent, even if not by face there.
And what a great note to end on. Sorry to interrupt, Lexi.
That's okay. I was just going to say, I wanted to take a moment to recognize all your incredible work and insights, and thank you all so much for being here. I really appreciate it.
100%. And thank you also to our audiences here too. We do have some more amazing content coming up later this week. So please be sure to check out the agenda up here at the top of the screen for other panels throughout the rest of the week. And we will see you later. Bye.
Thanks all.
Thanks, everyone.